Do you still not understand? High school dropouts are so slow to catch on, it's frustrating. Low education is a disgrace to this company. These heartless words were hurled at me in front of 70 new hires. The sheer harshness of it left the room in complete silence for a moment. My entire body burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. There was no reason for me to work at a company where I was spoken to like this. Understood. It seems there's no place for me here, so I will be declining the job offer. With a smile, I stood up from my seat. If anyone was going to be troubled by my withdrawal, it would be Rachel, the department head. My name is Sebastian. I'm a 36-year-old video creator, and I've recently decided to change job. The one who encouraged me to make this move and introduced me to an advertising company was my father, Harry. But just because I followed my father's advice didn't mean we had a good relationship. If anything, my father and I had been in a strained, antagonistic relationship for years. Having earned a substantial income in the advertising industry, my father had absolute confidence in his own judgment. He was always forcing his opinions onto me and the rest of the family. Looking back now, I can see that he was right more often than not. But when I was younger, I couldn't stand the idea of having my future decided for me. His controlling nature was especially evident when it came to my education. My father had no hesitation in doing whatever it took to set me on the path to success. Ever since I was a child, he sent me to prestigious prep schools and had me take entrance exams for top private middle schools. I had an older sister and a younger sister, but as the long-awaited son, my father placed all his expectations on me. However, what fascinated me wasn't the life of a high-achieving elite, it was music, film, and other forms of art. At first, I was just captivated by watching them. But soon, I wanted to create them myself. By middle school, I was already making videos on my computer and showing them to my friends. One day, I was asked to create a promotional video for the school's concert band. That became my very first project. I put everything I knew as a middle schooler into that video and uploaded it to the school's website. To my surprise, I received an offer from an external organization that appreciated my style. For the first time in my life, I felt the thrill of being recognized for something I had achieved on my own. The filmmaking skills I had taught myself were now being valued by others. The day after my 15th birthday, I started my own video production company and began accepting various commissions. Of course, I was proud to have my abilities acknowledged. But more than anything, I wanted to become independent from my parents as soon as possible. By the time I entered high school, my father's interference had become unbearable, and I was desperate to move out. Fortunately, my work had gained a steady following, and my business was thriving beyond my expectations. I was earning enough to support myself. Perhaps the idea of a 17-year-old filmmaker added to the intrigue. I wanted to build a future in video production. After much thought, I decided to drop out of high school and move to the US to further my technical skills. When I announced my decision to quit school, my father was furious. I left home practically disowned and threw myself into studying and filmmaking in the US. Years later, when I returned to Japan, I kept my distance from my family. Back in my home country, I continued working as a freelance video creator, taking on various projects. 15 years later, I now oversee video production projects, managing and directing teams. Through my work, I met my wife, and we're now expecting our first child. She's 5 months pregnant. As I ran my hand over her growing belly, grateful for the joy in my life, I received some unexpected news. My mother called to tell me that my father had collapsed. Hearing the news, I rushed back to my hometown. After decades away, the sight that greeted me was my father lying in a hospital bed, frail and emaciated. His grip on my hand was much weaker than I remembered, and with tears in his eyes, he pleaded with me. "Please, come visit home more often, and find a stable job so your parents can have peace of mind. I can introduce you to the company I worked for." Hearing him struggle to say these words, I couldn't bring myself to refuse. The once dominant man I knew was now weeping before me. I decided to do one final act of filial piety. But I soon realized just how cunning my father still was. Because the moment I agreed to take the job, he started recovering at an incredible pace. In less than 2 weeks, he was well enough to be discharged for home care. The very next day after returning home, he was happily devouring a beef bowl with rice. If you're feeling this good, then there's no need for me to take this job. I was exasperated and tried to quit pursuing a job, but my father stopped me, saying he had already made all the arrangements for me to join the company. Even if I'm doing better, now that you have a wife and a child on the way, having a stable income would be good for your family. If you don't like it, you can quit anytime. But at least experience working in a company once. He said this with a calm expression, popping a few rice cakes into his mouth as if nothing had happened. I was already 35. When I was single, I could survive anywhere with just my skills. But now that I had a family, I found myself thinking about the next few decades of my life. A stable income would mean security for my wife and child. Once that thought crossed my mind, it seemed childish to reject my father's proposal out of sheer stubbornness. In the end, I decided to join the company he recommended. It felt like I was walking down a path he had meticulously prepared for me, which didn't sit well. But as a man, I intended to keep my promise. From that day forward, I started wrapping up my video production work. I finished my final project just before the orientation at Southfield Agency, the major advertising company my father had introduced me to. The day of the orientation. I left home early and headed to the event hall where the orientation was taking place. The suit I wasn't used to wearing felt suffocating around my neck and waist. The thought of wearing this every day made my steps feel heavier, but I reminded myself that I was doing this for my wife and our unborn child. When I arrived, the venue was already filled with new employees checking in. I had been hired as an experienced professional, but most of the others were fresh graduates. Seeing these young, energetic faces reminded me of how I used to be. As I was lost in sentiment, wondering if I had once been like that too, I completed the check-in process and was walking down the hallway toward the venue. Suddenly, I was called out loudly from behind. "You there, stop slacking off and help out." The one who shouted was a woman in a white business suit. She looked to be in her 40s, clicking her heels as she approached me with a commanding presence, scanning me from head to toe. "You're an unfamiliar face. What department are you in? What's your name?" "I'm Sebastian. I don't know my department yet." At my response, she dramatically grimaced and raised her voice. "You don't even know your own department? If you think you can avoid grunt work with lame excuses, think again." I really don't know. I'm a new hire, so I was supposed to be assigned today." It seemed she had mistaken me for an existing employee. I thought that would clear things up, but instead, she burst into loud laughter. "What? You're a new employee at your age? That's hilarious. You're obviously not in your 20s. I'm 35. I was hired as an experienced professional." Being mocked right off the bat didn't sit well with me. I was about to walk away when she continued pestering me. "An experienced hire? Someone like you managed to pass the company's screening? What kind of sneaky tricks did you pull?" Ha! It was true my father had introduced me, but I had gone through the proper hiring process. I let out a vague sigh, but she simply crossed her arms, smirking down at me. "Here's a tip for you. If you want to get ahead, you'd better stay on my good side. I'm Rachel, the head of sales. I have connections with the higher-ups, so you do well to make yourself useful to me." With that, she strutted off, heels clicking against the floor. I was astonished by how rude some employees were, but I brushed it off and headed into the venue. The spacious hall was lined with tables, separating the fresh graduates from those of us hired as experienced professionals. The new graduates all wore identical black suits, their faces tense with nervousness. Meanwhile, the experienced hires at my table ranged from people who looked as young as high school students to those even older than me. I couldn't help but wonder what kinds of careers these people had before joining. The thought excited me. Eager to hear their stories later, I sat at my seat, flipping through the distributed materials while waiting for the orientation to begin. As more people filled the seats, the event started right on schedule. According to the program, the first speech was from the company president. When Mr. Nelson stepped onto the stage, every new hire straightened up, their expressions serious. As I listened attentively, his speech revealed a sincere and passionate personality. He spoke with enthusiasm about strengthening the advertising industry as a whole, and I could see the new hire's eyes start to shine. If this is the kind of leadership this company has, maybe working here won't be so bad, I thought, feeling slightly more optimistic. But that hopeful feeling was quickly shattered. After Mr. Nelson finished his speech, an announcement was made that there would be a short break until the next session was ready. The tension in the room eased and quiet conversations began to spread among the attendees. Glancing at my table, I made eye contact with the young man sitting to my right, who then spoke to me. "You're part of the experienced hires too, right? My name is Kyle, and I'm a web designer. Looking forward to working with you. I'm Sebastian, a video creator, likewise." Kyle had a straightforward and confident manner, leaving a good first impression. As we exchanged light conversation in hushed tones, a familiar high-pitched voice suddenly rang out. "Oh, what a wonderfully diverse-looking table. I see this is where they put the non-fresh graduates." It was Rachel, the woman who had insulted me in the hallway earlier. Smiling widely, she approached and scanned the experienced hires at our table one by one. As I recalled her rude behavior in the hallway and braced myself, Rachel pulled out some documents and raised her voice even more. "Even if you were hired for experience, you couldn't even make it into the company through fresh graduate recruitment, could you? I wonder if people like that can really keep up here. I suppose we'll start you off with grunt work." What kind of company insults new hires on their first day? The people at my table exchanged uneasy glances. While everyone was still dumbfounded, Rachel casually flipped through her documents, humming to herself. As expected, not many impressive ones this year. "Oh, Kyle?" Rachel glances back and forth between the documents in her hand and Kyle, who is sitting next to me, nodding to herself as if confirming something. "Oh, you're the one. Someone like you is more than welcome here. Looking forward to seeing your hard work." "Yeah. Oh, thank you." Kyle tilted his head in confusion but still politely bowed. His resume must have been impressive. Seeing that Rachel could recognize talent, I briefly reconsidered my opinion of her. But the next moment, she made a statement that left me speechless. With a chuckle, she looked at me and declared loudly, "And then there's this guy. Wow, you didn't even graduate high school? A middle school graduate trying to work at a top-tier company like this? That's bold." The entire room went silent. The moment I realized she was calling me that guy, my body burned with anger and embarrassment. Being publicly humiliated in front of 70 new hires, I clenched my jaw and slowly lifted my head. Meeting my gaze, Rachel smirked, then waved her hand dismissively like she was shooing away a stray dog. "Still not getting it? Middle school graduates are slow to catch on. It's frustrating. There's no way someone like you can handle a proper job. A low-education employee is an embarrassment to this company." "Understood. It seems there's no place for me here, so I will be declining the job offer." There was no reason to put up with this. The only reason I had agreed to this job was to grant my father's wish. Now that he had miraculously recovered, there was zero reason for me to stay and endure this humiliation. With a smile, I announced my resignation and stood up. A wave of murmurs spread through the hall as I turned to leave. Yet, Rachel remained smug, grinning like she had won. "Honestly, I was worried about having an uneducated person like you as my subordinate. You'd probably struggle just following basic instructions. But at least you have enough self-awareness to quit before embarrassing yourself. Good for you, good for you." Rachel continues to laugh to herself, giggling uncontrollably. Someone like her wasn't worth reasoning with. I turned my back on her without saying another word. It was only then that Rachel finally realized I was actually leaving. She grabbed the microphone and called me out. "All new hires, please return to your seats immediately. Your selfish behavior is disrupting the orientation." Rather than retracting her offensive remarks, she singled me out, blaming me alone. By broadcasting her words through the microphone, she wanted to make it seem like I was the unreasonable one for leaving in the middle of the event. This way, she could maintain her image as a superior reprimanding a disrespectful subordinate rather than the instigator of the situation. "You just said that people like me are an embarrassment to this company. I'm simply following through on that and withdrawing my job offer. Why are you trying to stop me?" It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Still exuding confidence, she puffed out her chest and continued lecturing me. "In the real world, people say things you don't like. Walking away every time that happens is hardly professional." I stared at Rachel in disbelief, but she showed no sign of remorse and continued to criticize me confidently over the microphone. "That being said, if you truly wish to decline your offer, I will respect your decision. If you don't want to work here, no one will force you to." She remained firm in her stance, painting me as the problem while making herself look reasonable. She must have used tactics like this many times to ensure she never took the blame. For a moment, I considered publicly repeating everything she had just said to me. But this was the company's official orientation. If I made a bigger scene, it would only disrupt the event and trouble the other new hires. Besides, I had nothing to lose by quitting. The one who would truly be troubled by my departure was Rachel. With that in mind, I followed through with my decision and left. Kyle and the others at my table watched the exchange, concern evident on their faces, but no one spoke up. Feeling countless eyes on my back, I walked out of the hall and loosened my suffocating tie. When I got home, I briefly explained the situation to my wife, telling her I had decided against corporate employment. I left out the details of the insults but mentioned that I was judged solely by my academic background. She nodded quietly. We had been together for years. She knew my personality and how hard I had worked to get where I was. She never once assumed I had thrown away the opportunity on a whim. Without needing further explanation, she simply smiled warmly and said she trusted my decision completely. "I'm sorry for worrying you, especially while you're pregnant. But I promise I will protect our life together with everything I have." With renewed determination, I decided to pour myself fully into my work as a video creator once more. In the end, I never spent a single day as a corporate employee. But this profession where I could choose how I worked suited me far better. Feeling a sense of excitement I hadn't felt since my early days of independence, I dove back into my craft. Just as I was about to start reaching out to my past clients, something unexpected happened. I received a notification that I had won first place in an international video competition. The competition focused on videos created within the past 3 years that used AI technology to bring smiles and emotional impact to viewers. Since I had originally planned to enter the corporate world, I had submitted one of my past works as a final tribute to my solo career. By the time the results came in, I had almost forgotten about my entry. When I read the news, I jumped with joy. Seeing my rare display of excitement, my wife was momentarily shocked. But once she realized I had achieved something incredible, she celebrated just as passionately. That night, we went to our favorite restaurant to commemorate the win. As the first ever Japanese winner, my name spread rapidly. By midnight, it was all over the internet. By the next morning, my achievement was being reported nationwide on television. Congratulations flooded in from friends and colleagues, and job offers poured in nonstop. I was still processing everything when I noticed multiple voicemail messages on my personal phone. The calls were from none other than Southfield Agency. The first few were from Rachel, but she sounded so frantic that I couldn't even understand what she was saying. It wasn't until I listened to Mr. Nelson's message that the request became clear. He wanted me to come to the company the next morning. I had already rejected the offer, so what could they possibly want? Curious, I decided to pay them a visit the next day. The next morning, when I arrived at the designated conference room, a few people had already gathered there. Among them were Mr. Nelson, the company president who had spoken on stage yesterday, and Rachel, who was glaring at me with a scowl. And for some reason, even Kyle, who had been sitting next to me at the orientation yesterday, was there, waiting for my arrival along with the others. As soon as I stepped in, Rachel raised her voice. "Sebastian, why did you leave without permission yesterday? Because of you, I got scolded." "Calm down. Let's hear his explanation first." As soon as Mr. Nelson reprimanded her, Rachel pouted but fell silent. After motioning for me to sit, Mr. Nelson began speaking with a gentle expression. "Sebastian, I saw the news. Congratulations on your award. The entire company has been buzzing since this morning after learning that one of our new hires won the competition." According to Mr. Nelson, several teams from within the company had entered the competition. As an advertising agency, winning an international award would have validated the company's high standards, so they had spent a year preparing their submissions. But when the results were announced, all the internal teams had been eliminated. And yet, I, who had just attended the onboarding ceremony, won the grand prize, turning me into the company's newest high-potential recruit. However, the excitement didn't last long until they discovered that I had already declined the job offer. Our company hires experienced professionals with the assumption that they will proceed to full employment. So why did you decline before reaching that stage? Apparently, no one had informed Mr. Nelson of the process that led to my decision to decline the offer. While amazed at the company's poor communication, I explained to Mr. Nelson everything that had happened during yesterday's onboarding ceremony. Of course, Rachel couldn't stay quiet. She kept interrupting with, "That's a misunderstanding," or "That's not how I interpreted it." Each time, Mr. Nelson sternly told her to be quiet so I could continue speaking. I was insulted because of my educational background and age, so I determined that I could not work here. I also did not want to unsettle the other new hires, so I chose to withdraw my offer in a way that aligned with Rachel's wishes. "I see. So that's what happened." After hearing everything, Mr. Nelson let out a deep sigh and held his head in his hands. Seeing this, Rachel glared at me and began shouting, "Because of you, even Mr. Nelson is troubled. If you feel bad, then take back your withdrawal." Rachel, still as rude as ever, aggressively pressed me. "Even if you have a low education level, you won an award, so you can work here. Why are you just standing there silently? Sign the acceptance letter already." "Enough. Show some respect to the son of Mr. Montgomery." Before I could say a word, Mr. Nelson's furious voice echoed through the conference room. "Mr. Montgomery's son? That's right. The person you've been so rude to is Sebastian, the eldest son of the former president and current chairman of Southfield Agency." As Mr. Nelson introduced me, Rachel's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she stepped back. Her face instantly turned pale, her knees shook violently, and she collapsed onto the floor. "Wait, Mr. Montgomery's son? But the person who received the job offer this year was Mr. Nelson's son, right?" "My son? What are you talking about, Rachel? I only have a daughter, and she hasn't joined the company." Hearing Mr. Nelson's angered response, Rachel pointed at Kyle with a trembling finger. "But then what about Kyle? I thought he was your son, so I've been treating him nicely since yesterday." His last name is Nelson too? So you just assumed and dragged him here? He has the same surname as me, but he's a complete stranger." Kyle, hearing his name mentioned, flinched in surprise as all eyes turned to him. Looking nervous, he bowed slightly, but even at a glance, he looked nothing like Mr. Nelson. It was clear that Rachel had misunderstood and had brought him into this mess without him knowing anything. I felt sorry for him, but Rachel still refused to admit defeat and kept making excuses. "Fine, I admit I was mistaken. But that means Sebastian got in through nepotism, right? Sebastian was not hired through connections. We recognized his talent and wanted him to work for us. He has the skills to win an award. How can you still deny his abilities? Growing even angrier, Mr. Nelson pulled out a thick stack of documents. It was my employment history, which I had submitted during my job search. Back in high school, I had started a company while experimenting with video production. After moving to the US, I worked on web and video projects, eventually gaining recognition and landing jobs creating stage visuals for artists. When I returned to Japan, I leveraged that experience and gained fame as a filmmaker known for dynamic camera work. Sebastian's visual style and compelling storytelling are incredible. Personally, I'm a huge fan. I believed he would inspire not just our young employees, but the entire company, so I asked Mr. Montgomery to have him join us. I thought, he was just a middle school graduate. Rachel trembled in a panic as Mr. Nelson glared at her sharply. But no matter how much she tried to cry her way out of it, Mr. Nelson's anger did not subside. She glanced around the room, but realizing that neither I nor Kyle would come to her aid, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Rachel, don't you have something to say to Sebastian? Understood. At Mr. Nelson's prompting, Rachel sluggishly lowered her head in a bow. She was only apologizing because she was told to, but even so, I decided to accept the fact that she had apologized. It seemed Mr. Nelson felt the same way. Just as he let out a relieved sigh, his secretary approached him with some business. Excuse me, but I need to step out for a moment. Sebastian, can you stay a little longer? I don't mind. I figured my father would hear about this through Mr. Nelson anyway. Not wanting things to get more complicated, I chose to stay put. I thought nothing else would happen, but I was naive. The moment Mr. Nelson's footsteps faded entirely, Rachel abruptly lifted her head and glared at me with sharp eyes. I apologize, so that settles everything, right? You'll be coming to work starting tomorrow. If you don't, I'll get scolded for letting a golden egg slip away. No, I've already declined the offer. I won't be coming back. Surprised by how drastically her attitude had changed now that Mr. Nelson was gone, I firmly refused. But Rachel, gritting her teeth, refused to back down. Think about my position. I've been blamed all morning for driving you away. You should be the one begging for this job since I'm generous enough to hire someone with such a low education level. So her apology was completely insincere. She hadn't accepted anything or reflected at all. Her relentless condescension finally pushed me past my limit. You keep looking down on me, calling me uneducated or a middle school graduate, but while I was in the US, I studied film at Columbia University. Columbia? So what? I graduated from a prestigious private university in Tokyo. She clearly had no idea what I was saying. In fact, she folded her arms proudly, flaunting her own education, until her expression drastically changed. Kyle, who had been silently listening until now, suddenly turned bright red with excitement. Wait, what? Columbia University? That's one of the top schools in the film industry. It ranks among the top 20 universities in the world. Huh? World rankings? Even after hearing that, Rachel still didn't get it. Kyle let out an exasperated sigh and shook his head. This is huge. Even the University of Tokyo is around 30th and Kyoto University is somewhere in the 60s. There's a massive gap between Japanese universities and Columbia. In other words, Sebastian is top tier in both filmmaking and academics. Kyle, unable to contain his excitement, kept exclaiming how incredible it was and bombarded me with questions about life at Columbia University. Watching this, Rachel initially stood there with her mouth hanging open, but soon her face turned red with a mix of anger and humiliation. So what, Columbia, Columbus, whatever, I'm the department head here. I outrank you entry-level employees. Like I said, I'm not joining this company. With a sigh, I told them once again that I was declining the job offer. At that moment, a deep, menacing voice echoed from behind Rachel. Rachel, it seems you haven't reflected enough. Mr. Nelson, when did you? Having finished his business, Mr. Nelson was now standing there, glowering at Rachel with a thunderous expression. Our company prides itself on accepting talented individuals from diverse backgrounds. Judging someone based on their education is unacceptable. Having been caught in the act, even Rachel couldn't come up with an excuse. She opened and closed her mouth repeatedly, flustered, but Mr. Nelson pressed further. I also received another report about you just now. Kyle, would you mind explaining? Ah, yes. Summoned, Kyle stood up nervously. And in front of both Rachel and me, he made a shocking revelation. After yesterday's orientation, Rachel asked me to exchange personal contact information. I refused at first, but she kept insisting on getting my phone number and address. Shut up. That has nothing to do with this. Rachel's face turned bright red as she desperately tried to stop Kyle from talking. She took a step toward him, but the sharp glare from Mr. Nelson froze her in place. Please continue, Kyle. So Rachel was making advances toward you? That's right. I was confused about why she would approach me, someone who had just received a job offer. But today, the mystery was solved. Rachel had mistaken me for Mr. Nelson's son. At Kyle's words, Rachel covered her face with both hands and collapsed to the floor. It's not like that. You're misunderstanding. I just wanted him to feel comfortable reaching out if he needed help, so I asked for his contact information. Rachel, you really are. Finally, Mr. Nelson's fury erupted at Rachel's endless excuses. Ignoring her as she hung her head, Kyle continued his testimony. After the onboarding ceremony yesterday, Rachel had invited him to a one-on-one dinner. No matter how many times he refused, she kept clinging to him. When he finally gave in and went, she excessively praised him and kept emphasizing that she was on his side. After saying all that, Kyle grimaced and held out his phone for us to see. Here's the proof. Since early this morning, I've received numerous personal messages from her, and I didn't know what to do, so I reported it to the company. Stop it. Don't show them that. Rachel screamed desperately, her face drenched in cold sweat and tears, but it was too late. The message history on Kyle's phone was flooded with texts from Rachel. Most of them were sweet, affectionate messages, as if she were texting a lover. Filled with heart emojis and playful symbols, the texts were blatantly inappropriate for a superior to send to a subordinate. So, Rachel, you were trying to start a relationship with Kyle because you thought he was Mr. Nelson's son? What's wrong with that? Love is free. I don't want to be judged by age or status. Mr. Nelson, the company president, saw our message exchange, leaving nothing left to hide. Rachel, now unfazed, brazenly talked back to me. You, of all people, have no right to say that, considering how much you've judged me for my age and education. Besides, a superior pressuring a subordinate into a relationship is completely inappropriate. Whatever. If he's not even the president's son, then I have no interest in Kyle anyway. Rachel finally collapsed onto the floor, wailing loudly without any regard for the people watching. After throwing her tantrum, she slumped down, silent and drained, until the security guards Mr. Nelson had called arrived and dragged her out of the room. Sebastian, I apologize for letting you witness such disgraceful behavior. And Kyle, I'm sorry you had to go through that. Mr. Nelson bowed his head to us, then let out a long, exhausted sigh. As for Rachel, I will take full responsibility and see that she is dealt with appropriately. Kyle, I want you to feel at ease and continue working here. Yes, thank you so much. I look forward to working here. Mr. Nelson, the company president, personally spoke to Kyle, who bowed repeatedly. Seeing his nervous yet earnest demeanor, Mr. Nelson allowed a slight smile before turning his gaze to me. I would still like you to join our company as originally planned, Sebastian. I'm sorry, but I've already decided to focus on my own work. I had already declined the job offer, and thanks to the award announcement, I was receiving many job offers. I felt bad for Mr. Nelson, but I had no intention of returning to this company. Mr. Nelson seemed to understand my firm resolve and let out a wry chuckle. I see. I apologize for pressing the issue. In that case, would you be willing to act as a special advisor to our company? We would value your insights. Yes, if I can be of help, I'd be happy to. I've always been interested in the company my father built over the years. As I answered with a smile, Mr. Nelson extended his hand and we shared a firm handshake. Later, an internal investigation into Rachel was conducted. It revealed that she had repeatedly used her position to harass subordinates, either by making advances on them or by assigning them unfair workloads. Furthermore, it was discovered that for years, she had embezzled company funds, using them to finance dates with her favorite employees. Only when her position became truly endangered did Rachel finally apologize, but Mr. Nelson did not waver. As a result, she was dismissed with immediate termination and was ordered to pay damages. Drowning in debt to cover the compensation, Rachel struggled to find a new job, but her condescending attitude toward others had not changed. Because of that, no company would hire her, and she now barely survives on temporary gigs, living paycheck to paycheck. She once prided herself on her education and status, but now she works under younger supervisors who scold her daily. As for me, my life became even more fulfilling after that. I welcomed my first child into the world. The moment I held my baby in my arms for the first time, I was overwhelmed with a joy beyond words. When I exclaimed that this happiness rivaled my feeling upon winning my award, my wife burst into laughter. And I wasn't the only one overjoyed. Every time we visited my parents' home, my father's face would light up as he doted on his grandchild. He had fully recovered from his illness and was now healthier than ever, not even catching a cold. Watching him, I realized I needed to push myself even harder to keep up with him. And so, my days as an advisor for Southfield Agency continue, fulfilling my role as needed. I frequently visit the company, and every time I run into Kyle, he never fails to shower praise on my work. I saw your latest project, Sebastian. The way you use colors is incredible. Please teach me your techniques. Since he eagerly looks up to me, I've decided to pass on my skills and knowledge to him. Meanwhile, my own company has been thriving, consistently releasing new projects. Recently, I've received numerous requests from both domestic and international artists, and my work is now being featured in TV commercials and across the internet. And now, I've taken a bold step toward a new challenge. Having once been completely dismissed by Rachel, my experiences in life outright denied, I began seeing the world from a fresh perspective. Until now, I had always created visual works for clients. But this time, I wanted to create something entirely my own. Driven by that passion, I directed my first short film and it won multiple international film awards. I've come to realize that no matter what happens in life, it all depends on how you perceive it. Every experience can be a stepping stone for growth. Ahead of me lies a future filled with endless possibilities. And from here on, I want to keep creating films that bring light and inspiration to people's hearts.